Hello. I decided to make a video about my recent books I've gotten from the library, and also just today I was thinking it would be good to make a video about a certain theme that's been on my mind for whatever reason today especially, but recently in the short novel Chess Story by Stefan Zweig. And if you haven't read that one, the main thing that struck me was one of the characters. So it's about a chess game between a world champion and just a random passerby who says he hasn't touched a chessboard in 15 years. But he does eventually tell his story that he was imprisoned, and the only thing he could do to get his mind off of the nothingness is he stole a book about like the top 150 chess games in history, and then he just started running them through in his head. And this all starts by the narrators on a boat with the chess, like the grand champion of the world, and him and some random Scottish guy who are horrible at chess are playing a game against the champion, and they're getting totally destroyed. And then this guy who became obsessed with chess swings by and helps them draw the game, which they would have never done by themselves. And then that's when he mentions that he hasn't touched a chessboard in 15 or 20 years, so everyone there is amazed, and then he walks off, kind of annoyed with himself that he let go in that way. He let himself go. But so in that way, it's been interesting because a lot of Zweig's stuff deals with obsession, like Letter from an Unknown Woman, and really I go back and forth with the concept of obsession, because in a way it's good. There's an interview with McCarthy where he says that when he was young, the teacher would ask if anyone had hobbies, and the kids didn't say, they didn't basically. And then he said that he was so surprised that he could hand out a hobby to every person there and still have 40 or 50 left over. And then he also has this little line where he hasn't been bored in 50 years, he said. And I do feel that way. I'm never bored. But I do get like obsessed with things, I think. Not necessarily the lack of control, because there's always an amount of control. It's just the consequences really aren't that bad. Like, to put it in the context of my book stuff, I'm always trying to find the next good thing, the unappreciated thing, something I haven't heard of yet. A lesser known book by a well-known author, an author that people have looked down on but is actually good, something like that. Basically trying to prove myself wrong all the time. And it gets quite, the feeling gets quite strong. And this will become apparent when I show the books I've been getting from the library. And I like I said, I go back and forth with this feeling, because sometimes it can be good, where I always have something interesting to be doing, but sometimes it does get obsessive in the negative sense, where it ends up being all I think about, and it's not necessarily for a good purpose. It's not for a bad purpose, but sometimes there are other things I could be doing. But I guess I'll just continue this thought process as I show books, or just talk about them. Some of them aren't worth showing, but And a lot of these I haven't read either completely or at all yet. It's just kind of showing stuff that I thought was interesting. So the first one here is The Lighted Windows by Heimito von Doderer, if you want to see how to spell that. It's a short novel about an Austrian civil servant, Julius Zehal. And the thing that got me interested in him is that he was an Austrian guy writing in an older style in the 50s and 60s, and that's when he got super famous. And his collection of, I guess his novel, but it's a really long novel called Demons, is what interested me, but my library didn't have it. They only had it in German. But so I got this just to see what it's like, because it's a fairly short book. But the thing that interested me is that he was born in the modernist, like, the time, because when he was 20 it was like 1910, I think, around then. So that's when, like, Dublin and, I mean, all the modernists started, really. So that interested me, that he decided to be a more traditional author. And another one here, The Main Philosophical Writings and the Novel All Will by Friedrich Jacobi. And the thing that, like, struck my eye with this especially is he writes about some conversations he had with Moses Mendelssohn and with Lessing about Spinoza. And Moses Mendelssohn, I think, is the grandfather of Felix Mendelssohn. And then I started reading a little bit of Edward Allwill's collection of letters, published in 1792, and it reminded me a lot of the feeling, like just the general feeling of either like Hölderlin's Hyperion or Goethe, his The Sorrows of Young Werther. Just that late 1700s, really very clean thinking. It's the feeling I got from it, and I just read some of it so far. Another one I got kind of in the same area is Valéry, his Analects. That's what this edition is called, at least. But it's actually his collection from his notebooks, which the library also has, but it's quite large. But one in here that I remembered that I wanted to memorize was if you could see what I'm thinking, you wouldn't be able to finish your lunch. I think that's what it was. And I thought it would be kind of funny. In my psychology class, we had to do our first assignment was we had to do something socially unacceptable in public, but of course not illegal or anything. And I thought I didn't do anything really, because I didn't feel like it. It's obvious what she wanted to happen, so you don't have to actually do something. But I thought it'd be funny to yell aphorisms from like a second story window or something at people walking by. That being one of them. If you could know what I was thinking, you wouldn't be able to finish your lunch. Or like people at a restaurant. Another one I got because of one of my poetry teachers really likes him is George Oppen, his collected poems, which unfortunately I don't really like. At least his first collection, published I think in the early 30s. I don't like it. Discrete series, yeah, published in 1934. He lived a very interesting life, which, you know, that may be why his stuff's popular. I'm not sure, but yeah, I didn't like the poems. Another thing of poetry I got is called The Great Writing: The Story of De Soto in America. It's written by Lily Peter, who was born in 1891, and she lived to be over 100 years old, which I thought was amazing. And she lived in Arkansas her whole life. But it's basically an epic or at least a narrative story about Hernando de Soto. And it's actually pretty good from what I've read so far. It'll start off with like a couple quotes from the time, like Garcilaso de la Vega, the Florida of the Inca, the true revelation, or the true relation of a gentleman of Elvas, stuff like that. It'll quote it, and then she'll write, which is very interesting. I was just walking by and saw it. Another pretty interesting one here is Hideki Yukawa, The Traveler. It's an autobiography of the Japanese guy who won the Nobel Prize. And he seems to have lived a pretty interesting life. He starts out by saying his life was easy. Here's the beginning. My 50th birthday occurred in January last year. On that day I had lived just half a century. The path I had taken was not a difficult one, measured by the usual standards. I was born in a scientist's family and grew up with brothers who each became a scientist in one or another area. My education was broadly liberal. I did not toil in worldly ways. I had a fortunate environment. But my academic life is not so easy to analyze. While I was lucky in some ways, it cannot be denied that I experienced greater hardships than some others. Physics is a science that has made rapid progress in the 20th century. It could be said that I simply rode with the incoming tide of a new science, doing what I like to do as I like to do it. Nothing certain can be said except that I desire, as I did in the past, to be a traveler in a strange land, and a colonist of a new country. It's like, yeah, I think you can imagine why I like that. Another one I got is The Direction of Poetry, edited by Robert Richman, which I think was published in 1988, and it's basically a collection of new formalist poetry, published, I think, from like the 1975 to 1988 or something like that. And some of them were pretty good. The one especially that I liked, that I actually found before I read this, but Timothy Steele. He writes in that older style, maybe like you'd imagine A.E. Housman or Robert Frost, that kind of feeling. But his first collection is Something in Uncertainties, and then the second one is Sapphics of Anger, or From Anger, or To Anger, something like that. But I read both of them at the library, and he's really good. I was considering buying it, but I don't have enough money right now. Another interesting one that I just picked up from actually hearing about it beforehand, but also I thought the first couple pages were very good, is Auto da Fe by Elias Canetti. And it's interesting that he wrote it when he was 26, because it's a pretty intricate book so far. I think that's what I'm going to read next, actually. But what I've been reading now is The Broken Tower, the biography of Hart Crane by Paul Mariani. And I assumed from reading this that he was younger, Paul Mariani, but he's actually born in 1940. And he does like biographies of William Carlos Williams, Gerard Manley Hopkins. I can't remember who else he did, but he's pretty well known for his biographies, and he does write in a very good style as far as the biography goes. And then let's see, I got Minima Moralia by Theodore Adorno. I got this because I went to that Cormac McCarthy conference arranged by the McCarthy Society. It was in Austin this year, so I went to it. My teacher was actually the keynote speaker, so that's how I got in. But one of the guys talked about Adorno and kind of how he talks about Dachau as being the end of Western culture. And McCarthy also talks about that. And I've read parts of Minima Moralia in the past, but I just decided to check it out further. And then another one here, the collected poems of Chika Sagawa. who is a Japanese modernist woman. And I found this book by the press, Canarium Press, who my poetry teacher recommended me to read, because I said I was looking for modern day, like modernist poets basically, and he said they have that sort of a sensibility. And another one I got that I think is really good is The Upper Paleolithic Imagination and the Construction of the Underworld, Juniper Fuse by Clayton Eshelman, which he's the guy that translates Cesar Vallejo's poetry into English. And I also kind of was inspired in this way by McCarthy, the interest with like the Chauvet caves and Lascaux caves. Just it's all so impressive that someone 40,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago can write, like draw on the cave walls, and they even seem to have some sort of written language style with the dots and things. Which there's an hour-long talk with Lawrence Krauss and Werner Herzog and McCarthy that he talks about that. Another thing I got is the Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon, which is kind of like a journal. Here, I'll read one section. On the first day of the first month. On the first day of the first month, and on the third of the third, I like the sky to be perfectly clear. On the 5th of the 5th month, I prefer a cloudy sky. On the 7th day of the 7th month, it should also be cloudy, but in the evening it should be clear, so that the moon shines brightly in the sky and one can almost see the shape of the stars. On the 9th of the 9th month, there should be a drizzle from early dawn. Then there will be heavy dew on the chrysanthemums, while the floss silk that covers them will be wet through and drenched also with the precious scent of blossoms. Sometimes the rain stops early in the morning, but the sky is still overcast, and it looks as if it may start raining again at any moment. This, too, I find very pleasant. This was written, I think, around 1050 AD. Let me see exactly. If it'll say quickly, I don't want to waste too much time. Yeah, she was born in 965. 965. So this is the time that people in the West were writing about Beowulf and stuff, and Japanese society was so sophisticated that they were doing diaries. It's quite a difference. And then I got Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio. It was the Penguin edition. It was the Pu Song Ling, the guy who wrote it, is from 1640 to 1715. And it's an extremely bizarre book. It reminds me of, what's his name? That Russian guy. Daniil Karms. Wait, is that his name? The Karms guy, the Today I Wrote Nothing. I think that's his name. But it's kind of like absurd in that way, and I think it's interesting that Chinese people were writing like that long ago. Again, it just shows that they were truly sophisticated then. And then another one I got that's pretty interesting is the Journal of Socho, which all these I found just by walking the library for hours and just picking up stuff. The Journal of Socho is one of the most individual self-portraits in the literary history of medieval Japan. Its author, Saikuken Socho, 1448 to 1532, the preeminent linked verse poet of his time, was an eyewitness to Japan's violent transition from the medieval to the early modern age. So it was written kind of at the same time that Montaigne was writing, and it's really pleasant to read. He adds poetry in here, and it just kind of talks about all the stuff he does. I was looking for Basho's Narrow Road to the Deep North, but I didn't have it. Someone checked it out already. And then I just went to the library today and got some more books, so I got to show those too. Might as well just show everything. I got Settling the Earth, the Archaeology of Deep Human History. And I've already got one good idea from this. He talks about how people became rapidly intelligent, and it's because females prioritized a male with a large social group. And having a large social group implies that the person has a good memory, that the person can think quickly, so that other people will like them. So just so on and so on. And it talks about how women, in like other primates, women are like the powerful sex, wherever they are, the men have to be. Either they collect resources or whatever. Basically, it's a matriarchy for a lot of other animals, primates, and I think even some human societies that's the way it is. But with early humanity, it changed into the men defending the resources, even if the women gathered it. So it's very interesting. A lot of stuff to think about. Another one I got is Pierre Clastre, A Society Against the State, which is by a French anthropologist from the around 60s or 70s. And he writes about different South American tribes, basically, that they have a chief, but the chief doesn't actually have any power. Like if the chief would say, "Hey, go do this," no one would be obliged to listen to him. And so it kind of touches on anarchism and kind of how people just think blindly that something without a monarch or whatever wouldn't work. And then I got William Carlos Williams' autobiography, and it starts in a really funny way. "9/10 of our lives is well forgotten in the living. Of the part that is remembered, the most had better not be told. It would interest no one, or at least would not contribute to the story of what we ourselves have been. A thin thread of narrative remains, a few hundred pages about which clusters like rock candy the interests upon which the general reader will spend a few hours, as might a sweet-toothed child, preferring something richer and not so hard on the teeth. To us, however, such hours have been sweet. They constitute our particular treasure. That is all justly that we should offer." And then here's chapter 1. "I was an innocent sort of child and have remained so to this day. Only yesterday, reading Chapman's The Iliad of Homer, did I realize for the first time that the derivation of the adjective venereal is from Venus. And I, a physician practicing medicine for the past 40 years. I was stunned." I read about that autobiography on Amazon. Someone gave it like a 2-star review saying, usually authors give some sort of like chronological meaning to their autobiographies, and William Carlos Williams just says a whole bunch of anecdotes. But that, I assure you, was not a problem with the author. The reader. And then I got 20th century Chinese poetry, because I was reading the new literary history of modern Chinese literature, published by the Belknap Harvard Press, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I got a few good ideas from it, but it was weird. Like maybe 6 or 8 months ago, I went super deep into Chinese literature, like trying to find the interesting stuff, and I was reading through this new literary history of Chinese literature, and I had already found all of it. Like just, randomly going online, basically that sort of getting obsessed with it and just brute force, how a computer would crack a password or something. And I don't know, it did give me somewhat of a bad feeling. And I can't say exactly why. But I really do get, like, it's an obsession. And especially with, like, this modernist stuff, there's no real good reason for me to read it or to want to know everything about it. And there are plenty of, books that talk about this sort of thing, like Faust, want to know everything, and then you ruin your life, or it ends up being completely unsatisfactory, like Kierkegaard talks about it, the aesthete, where you always want something new, and you'll never be satisfied because that road is endless. And so that means people much smarter than me have gone down the same path and realized it's foolish. But I don't know if I have a choice, really. But the main reason I got this Chinese poetry is for the one poet, Su Shimo, who is, I think, considered the most famous Chinese poet, like in modern times at least. He's not like Li Po level or something, but I'm pretty sure he's considered. He actually went to Cambridge and wrote an interesting poem. I may link it in the description of this. But one of the books I found randomly that I thought was interesting was Ding Ling. That's the author's name. I found it a while ago when I went was really interested in like modernist era Chinese stuff, but the main book that was interesting to me is Miss Sophie's Diary. It was published in 1928, and actually one of the first lines is about, well, I'll just read it and you can imagine what it's about. 24th of December. It's blowing again today. The wind woke me up before daybreak. Then the attendant came in to light the stove. I knew that I'd never get back to sleep again, and that my head would start spinning if I didn't get up. If I lie there wrapped up in my quilt, I brood too much on all these weird notions. The doctor says it would be better if I had plenty of sleep and plenty of food, didn't read and didn't think, but that's impossible. I never get to sleep before 2 or 3 a.m., and I wake up before dawn. Windy days like this make you think of too many disturbing things. Besides, you can't go out when it's blowing hard, and what can you do, stuck in your room with no books to read? I can't just sit here by myself doing nothing and waiting for the time to go by. I spend all day enduring and putting up with things and waiting for the time to go by, wishing the winter would pass quicker. Once it's warmer, my cough is bound to get better. Then I'll be able to go south or to university, whichever I want. But this winter's too long. Now this is the line. I warmed my third drink of milk when the sun started shining on the window paper. Yesterday I heated milk up 4 times. And though I warm it up so often, I don't always drink it. It's a kind of exercise to build up my spirits and ward off irritation on a windy day like this. To be sure, it uses up a little bit of time, but sometimes it makes me more irritated than ever. That's why I didn't do it at all for the whole of last week. But when I couldn't think of any other solution, I had to do it again, to while the time patiently away. It's as if I were very old. I think there's a real ignorance of Chinese literature in the West still, and I think it's just amazing that, like, even back 100 years ago, people like Ezra Pound were trying to make it more popular, and still to this day that Su Shimo, one of the most famous Chinese poets, isn't translated into English yet, other than in anthologies. And I just saw an article today about The Dream of the Red Chamber, how it's not read. And then I got 3 others. The Great Fire of London, Niels Linde by Jens Peter Jacobsen. That's the book that Rilke really liked and inspired him to write the notebooks of Maltalores Brigge. And then I also got Dialogues with Luco by Cesare Pavese, which is interesting. He has some interesting ideas about myth in the beginning. It reminds me of Jordan Peterson's ideas. But that's most of the books. I had 30 books checked out recently, but I finished some of them. Well, if you have any thoughts on any of that, shoot. Listen to Obsession by Eugene Isaiah. I'll put a link of that too. Well, alright, thanks for watching. Death is Gang Boss.